Unhappy news, we are very happy to have Dr. Sina Fazelpour join us today for our Care AI seminar series talk. And Gus also wanted to thank Dr. Fazelpour for accepting this invitation on such short notice. As you probably saw in the bio, Sina is assistant professor of philosophy and computer science at Northeastern University. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of British Columbia and was a Shirk postdoc at Carnegie Mellon, where he worked with David Danks and Zach Lipton. Among many other accolades, he was also a council fellow on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Data Policy. And Gus also wanted to add that if you are looking for one of the definitive publications on algorithmic biases, then you need to check out Sina's 2021 paper in Philosophy Compass, entitled Algorithmic Bias, Senses, Sources, Solutions. So I encourage you all to check that out. I know I certainly will be. And on a personal note, Gus wanted to share that he first met Sina about 4 years ago at a summer workshop in neuroscience and philosophy at Duke. And during this workshop, philosophers took classes in neuroscience and neuroscientists took classes in philosophy. During one of their classes on the physics of fMRI, it was obvious that Sina was smarter than the rest of the philosophers in the class. And as it turns out, he also has a degree in biomedical physics. And this impression was certainly further confirmed when, after a talk by Carl Friston, Sina not only seemed to be the only person in the room who understood what Friston was talking about, but he even met with Friston afterwards to discuss the finer points of the free energy principle and other topics generally above the pay grade of philosophers. And having personally tried and perhaps mostly failed to understand the intricacies of the free energy principle, I can certainly say that this is no small intellectual feat. Gus wanted to bring up this anecdote to highlight the truly interdisciplinary nature of Professor Fazelpour's research. We're lucky to have him here today, and we are excited for the talk entitled Diversity in Sociotechnical Machine Learning Systems. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Fazelpour.
Well, thank you so much. This was an amazing introduction and brought so many memories. I didn't expect it. Like I had not thought about the Friston conversations. Yeah, I mean, I don't blame you. Free energy principle is like a, let's not even get there. There's a reason why I don't work on that. So yeah, thanks so much, and yeah, thanks to Gus, who I hope that he gets better and his family get better. But thanks for having me, thanks for inviting me, and of course we met through an interdisciplinary forum, and it's so amazing to see that you have the similar type of thing at the University of Guelph, and of course, as you know, probably based on my background, all the Ontario universities are very close to my heart. Where I did my studies at McMaster and University of Toronto, so. Didn't get to go, but I was around the area. So yeah, the title of my talk is Diversity in Sociotechnical Machine Learning Systems. And it's to a large extent based on a paper. Actually, I would say like probably all of it is based on a paper that I did with my wonderful collaborator, Maria de Ortega, who's an assistant professor at University of Texas, Austin. And it's a paper that should be coming out shortly. What is this about? As you probably all of you have seen, these predictive algorithms are kind of permeating all aspects of our society, right? They're influencing many aspects of our lives, and they're already used to drive or assist many important decisions about how opportunities and resources should be distributed in domains like healthcare, workforce, and criminal justice. The same thing happens in our personal lives, of course, right? So there are many algorithms on social media that decide or shape at least what we see, how we see it in terms of ranking, and what is considered acceptable as speech, what is not acceptable as speech, what is the representative, what is the representation of society, and so on and so forth. As you might already know, unfortunately, many real-world analysis of the impacts of these systems have highlighted several risks that they might have. And this has this is typically done in the case of discussions of fairness and justice, sometimes privacy. So many algorithms that are used in child welfare systems seem to be, in the words of Virginia Eubanks, punishing the poor. Hiring algorithms seem to be biased against women. And as we will see during the talk, algorithms can have racial biases depending on the choices that we make in designing them. More recently, some of the researchers have looked into the way that the design of algorithmic systems and various considerations that we have with respect to them interact with considerations of diversity, especially sociocultural diversity. So one line of research looks at what we might call diversity as a design desideratum in the context of designing machine learning systems. The idea here is that these systems impact our societies through hiring, recommendation, dating, search engines, and so on and so forth, the images that we see. And so it's important to see the type of affordances that they provide in our society. So there's this discussion of diversity in the, let's say, the images that we see when we search something and the way that those images are classified. So for instance, there's a question that's like systems that might correctly label some of the images as wedding images, but if those wedding images do not kind of conform to Western representations of wedding, then the classification is mistaken. Similar discussions with diversity when you search for a term like scientist or doctor. There's another kind of line of discussion about diversity, where here diversity is seen more along the line of kind of an organizational solution or partial organizational solution to algorithmic bias. The idea is that, of course, the construction pipeline of machine learning systems has many different stages. It's a long process, but it's socially embedded. There are many different teams and individuals involved in making decisions about different aspects of these systems. And so having diversity there, the idea is that can help us design systems that are ethically better, don't exhibit the type of biases that might be a matter of social concern for us. So this is kind of discussions of diversity, these two lines in the AI machine learning research. And it's not surprising, right? Diversity, sociocultural diversity, of course, is kind of one of the key values in our societies, in democratic societies, both for ethical and epistemic reasons. I take it that not everybody here is a philosopher, so I will be using the word epistemic a lot. And by epistemic, I just mean very broadly knowledge related, like how does it impact the kind of information gathering performance of a group, the way that they gather accuracy of their knowledge, their decision making. So that's what I mean by epistemic at a kind of broad level. So there's lots of interest, of course, among scholars in humanities in diversity too. And they ask different types of questions. They try to understand diversity's varied meanings. What do we mean by diversity in some contexts? Why do we want it in that context? How do we measure it, given a particular understanding of diversity? And how does it impact group performance or group dynamic? What moderates those impacts? So people in social sciences, psychology, organizational research, and humanities have spent a lot of time thinking about that. But when you look at kind of current works on diversity in the context of responsible AI, there is almost no connection to previous work on diversity in humanities, social sciences, and psychology. And so there's this gap. And the first question, of course, is like, why should it matter? Well, one reason that it matters is that much of the work on diversity in the context of AI and machine learning focuses on, especially when they're thinking about diversity as a design desideratum, like let's say how to select a subset of images for displaying. There's lots of focus on measures of diversity. How do we measure diversity quantitatively? And then coming up with algorithmic solutions for satisfying those measures. Maybe we put a constraint on the way that we optimize a model. But the problem is that it's often unclear what exact understanding of diversity underpins these measures and what motivates that understanding. And this matters, of course, because diversity is not really a kind of a monolithic concept. It's a multidimensional notions, and there are different understandings of diversity, and each of them have their own rationale that might or might not be applicable in a particular context. And at kind of any level, they're a matter of value judgments. And so this can lead to disconnects between intention and implementation, in the sense that I might want a diversity for a particular purpose, but I'm just using some measure of diversity in computer science because that's what I know people use to measure diversity. And we will see that this often happens. And another issue is that kind of this lack of specificity and precision about how exactly diversity might benefit group performance, especially in the sense that it might reduce algorithmic bias if you have diversity throughout the pipeline. It's not, again, connected to discussion on humanities. Again, this matters because when you look at the literature, sometimes you kind of encounter, depending on what type of work in this domain you're looking at, sometimes you see uninformative or kind of easily falsifiable generalities that you look at it and say, like, it's obviously the case that diversity might not really help here. Or you might look at cases that try to actually study whether diversity is actually beneficial, but as we will see, sometimes the experimental design of these studies are not actually suitable to seeing whether diversity is beneficial or not, for reasons that we will see. And more generally, if we are not aware of these particular pathways, we might just expect diversity magic, as if like we diversify our kind of team of software engineers and suddenly like there's no issue with algorithmic bias, which makes no sense. So my aim today is kind of try and close this gap and show why this matters, show how this kind of clarifies the discourse around diversity in machine learning. As I will show, it's crucial to think about why diversity matters and how it comes up, issues of diversity throughout the machine learning design pipeline. And this helps us also formulate more precise research and research questions and experimental designs. And it provides us with conceptual tools for thinking about kind of how to go deeper in some of the stuff that are there, and also thinking about potential avenues for new research. So before I go any further, one thing that I want to say is that I talk a lot about epistemic or functional benefits of diversity. It's very important to know in this context, I'm not making a business case for diversity, where the business case is the idea that diversity matters insofar as, and to the extent that it might provide these type of benefits from a business perspective. Let's say in this case, it might be industries that are involved in the design of AI systems. And I want to mention this explicitly because business case is a kind of a problematic approach to viewing the value of diversity. There are many reasons why we value diversity, and its potential benefits, functional benefits, obviously are just one of those aims, and maybe not even the most important one. And as we will see, they crucially depend on those other aims that we have. It's also problematic because it takes kind of as default homogeneity, right? Nobody actually expects you to give a business case for why our group, everybody should be similar to each other. So why should we make a case for why the group should be diverse? And this puts the burden on individuals that come from minority groups, because then they have to prove that like their being in the group somehow kind of creates this additional benefit that if we bring somebody similar, we should not expect. And finally, it's also worth noting that functional benefits are not the same as the kind of business benefits. There are many cases where diversity is beneficial because it kind of makes the groups a little bit more deliberative, critical, and that makes the process of reaching a consensus more thoughtful, but also longer in time. So it kind of reduces the time to convergence on a decision. So this might not actually go with business kind of ideals about efficiency. So with this, this is what I want to do today. So I first kind of introduce the first two parts. What is it that I'm talking about when I say discussions of diversity in humanities, social sciences, and psychological and organizational sciences? So the first part is about different understandings of diversity and kind of the different rationales that they have. The second part is about the different pathways by which sociocultural diversity in particular might impact group performance. And the contextual factors that can moderate this type of impact that diversity has. And finally, kind of part three, I will situate all of this in the life cycle of machine learning models or design. So the first part, which kind of draws both on the paper that I mentioned with Maria, but also on the previous work that I had done with my collaborators, Dan Steele, Kinley Gillette, Bianca, and Michael Burhurst. So suppose that we have a kind of a focal group and we want to ask, like, is this group diverse? So before kind of measuring it, we shall really think, what is our conception of diversity? How do we understand diversity? At a very kind of a general level, diversity, when we use it, we mean something like there's some sort of difference involved. Like everybody looks exactly the same, like probably there's no diversity. So, but of course, we can understand difference in many different ways, and different understandings of what this difference actually consists in gives rise to different conceptions or perceptions of diversity. The most obvious one, of course, would be that, okay, yeah, I will change the axis along which I compare individuals with each other. And put another way, I can make different choices about what attribute is the relevant one in the context. So I might talk about gender diversity, ethnic diversity, disciplinary diversity, and so on and so forth. And of course, a group that might be diverse from one perspective might not be diverse from another perspective. Now, when I say different understandings of diversity, this is not what I mean. I assume that these are the same. And so based on the work that we have done, we call this type of background situations that determine what kind of attributes might be relevant for thinking about the group members and the diversity of their composition, context of diversity. So we assume that this is given. Given this, we still have different types of understanding. We could still have different understandings of diversity, what diversity means, and why we should think about diversity in that way. And when we we decide that something is the appropriate concept of diversity, then and only then we should think about how we ought to actually measure it, quantify it, formalize it. Typically, the relationship between concepts to measure is one to many. And that's one reason why we have to actually first think, what is the concept that I care about before going to the measure? So this is kind of like a very forbidding figure. There are too many things going on, but I will go through this. This is like the overall scheme for different families of concepts of diversity. Let's just start with the kind of what we call the Witting group concepts of diversity. So we have our focal group. Is this group diverse? According to Witting group concepts, if we already, given the context, know what attributes are relevant, then more or less to a large extent, we can actually determine the diversity of this group. So consider the egalitarian notion. So suppose that we have a set of attributes, then I can just look at my focal group to see whether those attributes are kind of presented at equal proportions. So whether the kind of distribution of attributes in the group or people with those attributes is uniform, for instance. And this is a strict egalitarian diversity. And this type of thing, of course, is kind of maximal at equality. If we have equal representation of all the different attributes in the group, then diversity has been maximized. And this is a very, very popular way of thinking about diversity in literature on diversity. And there are different ways of measuring it. Typically, the kind of generalized entropy measures are used, where the idea, again, you can imagine that if we have uniform distribution, then nothing is concentrated on one part and so on. And so the entropy is kind of highest when we have uniform distribution in that way. And there's Blah's index or Simpson's index and many different measures. And they put different kind of emphasis on breadth and distributional evenness of things, like, do we want more attributes or do we care more about the distribution along those attributes? And all of these measures could also be weighted if we want. So they don't need to be a strict egalitarian. They could be weighted according to, let's say, the similarity that we see between different attributes. Let's say if our attributes are religions, we might think that some religions are more similar to each other. And so we might want to put less weight on diversity kind of distribution along those attributes. Why do we care about this notion? Well, there are different rationales. There's ethical, political rationales of this. It should be obvious. It's typically kind of egalitarian ideals and norms. We want some sort of equality of different perspectives, let's say, in the group. But there are also epistemic rationales here, and we will talk kind of more about some of this. But the broad idea is that when we have a variety of perspectives, interests, and many other ways of thinking, these are all epistemically beneficial. This can like help the group to perform better. So kind of Miriam Solomon talks about like pursuit of various projects. If you have different interests in scientific community, then you pursue different types of projects and you might cover kind of more possibilities. Helen Longino talks about kind of reducing the risk of unnoticed or unjustified assumption when you have kind of diversity of perspectives, because I might cover your, let's say, blind spot, whereas like if somebody is similar to you might not. And kind of an influential work is Lu Hong and Scott Page show the benefit of kind of diversity in terms of how it allows groups to explore better in problem-solving setting. And we have similar type of issues in learning settings. So this is kind of egalitarian notion. But notice that it has certain types of properties. It only focuses on a focal group, and it's symmetric in the sense that if I change the name of the attributes, let's say from men to women, and like keep the same distribution, it says nothing about like whether diversity has changed at all. Diversity remains the same. It's kind of blind to what the attribute actually means. Same with ethnicity and so on. And so it tends to kind of ignore how majority in moderately diverse groups relates to population or some reference population in general and social dynamics and other things that we sometimes think should be associated with diversity. So that's why like there are other understandings of diversity. So according to these comparative notions, at the very least, if we want to say something about whether a group is diverse, we should compare it to another thing, another group or more than that. In the representative sense, the idea is that the group is diverse insofar as it matches, so insofar as our focal group matches a reference population, which now there might be value judgments about what we choose to be a reference population, but this is the broad idea. And one way of one expression of this is by Phil Jacklin in the kind of discussions of diversity of viewpoints in journalism, where the idea is that this type of thing, the community is diverse insofar as it's representative of the political diversity in the total society. So this is one view. And there are many measures for this. There are kind of many measures like for coverage. There are measures for proportionality, demographic or statistical parity. Again, different types of measures. Why might we care about this? Of course, again, we might have ethical rationales like representative democracy, but we might also have epistemic rationales, right? In certain cases, we might think that it's a pretty bad idea to have equal distribution of like all different perspectives because some of them might be completely unfounded, right? You see this in discussions of climate change, for instance. Like, do we want to just invite give equal opportunities, different perspectives, or do we want to give opportunities in a way that is representative of the consensus of the scientific community? In which case, certain outlier views should not actually be invited that often. So this is the idea, because otherwise we should give equal weight. And so like that's kind of relates to disciplinary background and other types of things. But notice that this representative notion also, it just compares this focal group to more kind of reference population, but it ignores the kind of the social and historical dynamics of that group. And this clearly matters, right? In many discussions of diversity, what people care about is issues of historical underrepresentation and disadvantage. So we need to kind of bring that into. So then we have like this other notion of diversity where we might call it the normic concept, where here we assess the diversity of a group, our focal group, in relation to a non-diverse category in reference population. So we might think that there's a kind of a historically homogeneous group, and a group is seen as diverse insofar as it diverges from that, insofar as it does not fall within that category. And kind of one expression of this is in kind of Sandra Harding's work, where the idea is that one central concern is to include in scientific decision-making the groups that heretofore have been excluded from participating in decisions about research. So here is like the idea is that we don't go for mere diversity, but we actually kind of actively look for groups that have not been included. So are kind of diverge from what is the kind of the homogeneous status quo. Again, there are different measures here, a little bit less studies because obviously it requires much more contextual information. But interestingly, some of the recent work in machine learning, in the context of machine learning by Meg Mitchell and who used to be at Google and her colleagues, try to develop these kind of measures exactly in the context of subset selection. So what images you should see. Why might we want this conception? Well, again, ethical rationales. The idea is that this relates to social justice, kind of responding to historical injustices and underrepresentations, but it also has epistemic rationales in the sense that, well, it might not be bad to overrepresent more than like the presence in the population, some reference population overrepresents individuals' kind of diverse standpoints, because individuals who occupy or come to occupy those standpoints might have a better understanding of the workings of unjust kind of power structures, unjust systems. So think about like how architecture and city planning typically is kind of ableist in a particular way. And so individuals like disabled individuals might have a better sense of how kind of our blind spot that, like, say, I might not notice. Similarly, if our healthcare system is historically unjust, individuals who have been historically hurt by it might have a better understanding of the shortcomings of the system than somebody who is like from a status quo who benefits from it. So these are different understandings of diversity, but the main point is that these all depends on different types of rationale that might be more or less relevant in different contexts, and at kind of any rate depends on our value judgments. So we have to actually justify them. And depending on this, then we might have different kind of notions of how we ought to understand diversity and how we ought to measure it. So we should keep this in mind. Same goes with kind of different pathways of diversity. It's very important to understand how these things, how diversity might impact group performance and what is it that moderates this. So there are lots of people in philosophy, so I have done some work on this, but lots of work in organizational science, psychology, computational sociology that look at how diversity can positively impact group performance. Notice that I say can, not that it does, because as we will see, there are many factors that shape diversity's impact. But a core lesson here is that we should be serious about what exact mechanism is at play. Because if you are not, if you just look at input-output kind of a correlation, then we cannot actually give meaningful predictions about what will be the upshot of diversity or increasing diversity in a group, or how we should mitigate problems that might arise in diverse groups. So at a general level, kind of, I want to distinguish between two pathways of diversity. There might be more pathways like affective pathways, but here I just focus on cognitive pathways by which diversity can be beneficial for the group, and what I will call information elaboration pathways. So the idea of cognitive pathways is kind of pretty straightforward. The idea is that when you're doing a particular task, you draw on many different cognitive resources, right? Like you have your perspective, you have your kind of information, background knowledge, you have different ways that you might think about problems, you might have different disciplinary knowledge, and so on and so forth, right? You might have different information. Now, if the group is kind of cognitively, think about all of these things as your cognitive repertoire. If the group is everybody similar from the same, they has similar cognitive repertoires, of course, they're kind of their knowledge as well as their kind of blind spots overlap, correlate with each other. So it means that if they face certain problems that one of the group members is not very good at, the rest of them are not very good at either. Whereas if there is cognitive diversity in the group, cognitive heterogeneity, then they are kind of able to have a kind of broader variety of ways of thinking about the problem and cover more different types of problems. So here's one way of thinking about it, is in the kind of nice figure from Scott Page, where here the idea is that each of these letters, A, B, C, D, E, is think about it as an like ability, a tool that an individual might have, a cognitive tool. And so if two members think about it as have the same tool, that counts as a single tool. If you look at each individual here, I think this is Anne, is the most able individual, has the most ability, has the most tools. But if you want to look at how did we design the best two-person team, then actually Anne might not be part of that team. because there's lots of overlap between her tools and the tools of other members. Whereas between Barry and Cam, there's not much overlap, and so there's complementarity. These type of things are, of course, seen in a variety of domain, not just here, even in computer science, like some of the ideas in ensemble learning are kind of driven by these type of things. So note, importantly, that the best individual here might not be part of the best team. So sometimes when we are designing teams, we should actually really think about complementarity issues. So how does it relate to sociocultural diversity? Basically, the idea is that in certain contexts, of course, people that come from different backgrounds might have different experiences and so on and so forth. And so demographic diversity can induce cognitive heterogeneity or cognitive diversity, which in certain cases could be beneficial. Now, there are many different kind of nuances to this research, but probably the most important effect modifier for whether cognitive diversity can be beneficial to group performance is the nature and difficulty of the task. And you can imagine why, right? If the task is kind of routine and very easy, I can just do it by myself or people similar to me, right? I don't need anybody who's different from me. I don't even need social learning. So I don't need to depend on others. So it's very important to make sure that the task actually, one of the key modifiers of the task should be, requires kind of creativity, innovation, should be complex so that no individual can actually outperform everyone on every possible variation on the task. So this is the kind of cognitive pathway. Now, of course, just having different people in the group, that's not enough. We have, when there are different members in the group and we want to do a common task, then we have to actually kind of elicit information from other group members. We have to share information, process what others say, and kind of integrate them towards our shared task. And the idea in information and kind of these, all of these processes, elicitation, sharing, are kind of in diversity research are called information elaboration, the way that information is elaborated in the group. So the core idea in the information elaboration pathway is that identity diversity can counteract certain detrimental impact that identity homogeneity has on information elaboration. So here are kind of three things. I'll go through them one by one. One idea is that when we have an identity diverse group, this leads to expected cognitive differences. Note that there might not be any actual cognitive differences between me and somebody that doesn't look similar to me, but it's possible that I come to expect that there might be actually different information. And this has proven useful in kind of previous empirical studies, because in groups that are not, that individuals see each other as similar, they also assume that they're kind of cognitively similar, and they assume that they share the same kind of assumptions, information, and this leads to kind of key neglects in sharing important information. So if I don't share key information with you, then our group does not perform that well. Whereas if I think that you might not know what I know, or I think you might know something that I don't know, then we are actually more careful about that. There are trust pathways where, again, the idea is that if somebody is similar to me, it has been shown that individuals, maybe not consciously and intentionally, but they trust them more as sources of information. They trust in-groups or those who they perceive as in-groups. Whether this is kind of identity in a demographic sense, but or disciplinary sense, they just trust what in-groups say more in them. Whereas, and so this means that, like in many cases, you might tell me something and I perceive you as being an in-group, and I just uncritically accept the information that you give me, and I kind of revise my beliefs, even though your information might not be very accurate. And so again, identity diversity kind of counteracts this type of detrimental effects. And finally, there's conformity. And so lots of research on this that has been shown that because of conformity, people in many cases do not voice kind of dissenting views because they're worried about how the group will react to them. And this means that like the group misses some important information. And also people get quite upset when some in-group disagrees with them on something. So their reaction to novel perspectives about the issue is kind of, that might be too harsh. Whereas in diverse groups, it turns out that people are more easily voice dissenting views when they have it. And they're more easily kind of consider novel views. Now you might wonder, like, okay, I'm saying these things and these are all actually studies that have been done in the lab. I have done some studies here, but there's simulation, computer simulation. You might think, well, is it true really in diverse group that these things happens? And it's very important to kind of consider that all of these things that I've said so far actually require certain types of enabling conditions and certain types of background conditions. So these type of benefits, whether cognitive benefits or whether through the information elaboration, all of them happen when we have a kind of a list of condition. And this is like a very nice commentary on Scott Page's book by Catherine Phillips. And kind of she enumerates this condition like having diversity mindset, like group members should be open to social differences between each other. The group to begin with should have some type of diversity as opposed to be completely homogeneous. Maybe most importantly, the power dynamics in the group should be more egalitarian as opposed to hierarchical. And diverse groups should also have a kind of organizational and leadership support. And again, you can think about it as an analogy with, but this is also important to keep in mind because like you might have seen many recent cases with Google where they kind of fired some of their key responsible AI team members. So again, just hiring somebody because you think they will add to your team in certain dimensions without any support is actually setting up individuals for failure. So there are all of these things, all key kind of effect modifiers that influence the way that diversity might be beneficial in one dimension. The key point again is that when we want to study whether diversity can be beneficial in a particular setting, we have to ask questions that are specific. Like, what is the nature and complexity of the task? Is there interaction between individuals? And so can information elaboration questions come into play? And diversity's impact kind of vary across contexts and sometimes can be small depending on how things go, what the background conditions are. So we should not expect diversity magic and kind of don't tie the value of diversity to that business case. All right. So now we have all of these things. Now the fun part is actually applying it to the case of machine learning systems, right? So by life cycle of machine learning system, I mean this kind of broad process that we go from the very early way that we formulate a problem that a system is supposed to be solving to the kind of the deployment of the system and the way that it interacts with society and impacts society. And throughout this process, of course, different types of diversity considerations might arise. One type of consideration that I will focus on today is considerations about who influences the designs and goals of the system. So this is about who are the decision makers, what is the composition of decision makers, how do they interact with each other, and so on and so forth. But of course, there are other things. I will not talk about them, but I think it's important to mention them. Considerations such as like who is represented in the data sets that we use for training particular model. When we have a particular data set and we want to kind of make decisions on the basis of it, who is included, who's like if it's we have a data set and we want to kind of select a sample for kind of ranking on a Google image, for instance, who is included in the subset that we select, who benefits from the system, who is harmed by the system, and maybe more broadly, kind of who's affected by the deployment of the system, which again, there are different groups and some of them might be more direct stakeholders, some of them might be more indirect in the way that the system evolves in the environment. So I will just focus on the first set of the issues that I mentioned. So let's just start with kind of 4 examples of this. The people who design, who are involved, whose decisions kind of shape the system. So problem formulation, what is it? Oh, I should say, I forgot to say this. So Gus was very, very kind of too kind in saying that this is a definitive paper on algorithmic bias. This is a kind of survey article, so it kind of just aims to bring people the valuable work that has been done so far together. So I haven't done anything definitive in this paper, but it's very kind of Gus and Dylan to mention that. So what is problem formulation? Well, problem formulation is kind of the first step that involves a number of judgments. So this is a step that we want to go from our real world aim to kind of deciding what it is that the system should do and how it should function. So there are many judgments like, what is it that our practice wants to do? Like if it's like a student admission, what is the kind of, or a student counseling? what are the aspects of the practice? Second question is like, which part of the practice can we frame as something that is amenable to predictive or classification analysis? So you might think as student counseling, certain parts like me deciding which courses might fit with the background that a student currently has, that might be something that I can kind of define as a functional predictive task. Whereas other things like the relation between a counselor and a student might not be kind of the type of thing that is very easily automated from this predictive perspective. And this is an example that Eisenberg and Van den Hoven have in their nice paper. Suppose that we select some parts of the task to be given a predictive reformulation. What are the appropriate measurable proxies for the outcome of interest? So if we might want to predict who becomes a good student, what does good student mean? It's a contestable notion, very complex. And so we have to come up with some sort of measurable proxy for it. And that turns out to be quite tricky. Again, this is a decision that we have to make. And then suppose that we have made our prediction. What is it that we are going to do with it? What is our set of possible decisions that we have to make? Now, all of these judgments are sometimes made in the house by the organizations that want to use these algorithms, and they're sometimes outsourced to external groups. So, for example, state governments tend to outsource this type of development of risk assessment models for recidivism predictions to external firms. They often don't do it in-house. How could things go wrong here? Well, the problem formulation is key because it's the very first step that determines so many things. So the example of the healthcare that we opened with, and this is work by Obermeyer and others, provides a salient examples of the importance of problem formulation. So here, the company wanted to design a tool to enroll patients into a kind of a high-risk care management. And so the idea was that after you predict this, better somebody's like has high healthcare needs, and so it's high risk, then you can provide them with better medical support and resources. So healthcare needs is a kind of complex notion. It's kind of ambiguous. You have to define it in terms of something that you can unambiguously measure. So they define it, operationalize it in terms of total healthcare expenditure. But it's not very difficult to see that these two things can come apart. Somebody's healthcare need does not necessarily correspond to their amount of money that they spend on healthcare. And so this particularly was shown to harm demographics that didn't spend that much for whatever reasons, maybe economic inequalities or maybe justified historical reasons for not trusting healthcare system that much. Another example of why problem formulation might matter, suppose that we want to hire somebody. Do we want to hire for fit? I just talked about why complementarity matters in groups. Do we really want to hire somebody that fits in the sense, and here they're using the fit in the sense that they fit to the profile of high-performing individuals in the group right now? Is that really what I want? Or do I want to diversify the skills that my team has? This is, again, like another thing that we have to specify. Similarly, the last aspect, so we have, suppose that we have made predictions about, in this case, whether a student is likely to repay their loans or whether they will default their loans. The same type of algorithm, the predictive algorithm, can be embedded in very, very different problem formulation here, like depending on what it is that we do. So one of these papers, this one, is thinking about what can we do with these predictions in order to help the students, in order to support the students and provide with kind of prevent the student loan defaults, support through different academic means, for instance. This other paper aims to kind of deter borrowers with social stigma and shaming on online social media. So if it predicts that you're likely to default on your loan, it will come to your social media and tries to shame you. And the idea is that like this will prevent you from defaulting on your loan and you will repay the loan. So very different types of things. It's not very difficult to see why diversity matters here, right? The way that we decide like how to operationalize something like healthcare needs in terms of healthcare spending, if somebody was in the room that actually comes from a background that like their spending does not match their needs, they might have said something. So diversity is kind of relevant here, both ethically in terms of who gets a say. So in terms of political legitimacy and many other ethical considerations that we mentioned, also kind of epistemically, right? In terms of cognitive pathways, like you might notice something that I don't notice. And in terms of information elaboration, right? In terms of particularly if you're part of a group and I don't know, we are all engineers and like we just agree with each other very easily, then we might miss certain key important things. So again, there are different pathways that we have to consider. Similarly, we have to consider what conception might be relevant. So some of the recent work in machine learning, responsible AI, tries to bring diversity through different types of approaches. Here, I think they do it through collaborative causal modeling or something like that. But again, they only discuss diversity. They say diversity, but what is diversity and which sense of diversity do they want to really have? So again, depending on the context, you might, let's say, want to have representative diversity if we want to have like use some sort of algorithm in our city, and we want to have representative of different people from different neighborhoods, or we might have normic diversity if we think this technology is such that it disproportionately impacts historically disadvantaged community. So in the case of like policing, or in the case of recidivism algorithms, like we really need a kind of a normic notion of diversity as opposed to just a representative notion. So this is one example of why it matters to actually consider what it is that we mean by diversity, and actually kind of consider what is the composition of the team to begin with. So who makes design choices? Another aspect, after we have our thing, we have our problem formulated, then we have to decide how to design the system. So these are like, to a large extent, not completely, are technical choices. So what is our training data? What are the performance metrics that we want to optimize? What are the models that we want to consider for predictions? What learning algorithm we want to use, and so on and so forth. And in many cases, the team that is in charge of problem formulation is not the same team that is in charge of design and development of the software. Now, in many cases, you might read when you kind of look at the literature on whether, or at least journalistic discussion, as well as some of the work in kind of humanities-oriented work on responsible AI, there's lots of discussion about like how having a diverse set of software engineers or workforce in AI companies might lead to less biased algorithms. So this is one example, and this is a quite nice survey article of different types of AI ethics guidelines, where they kind of explicitly say diverse workforce is something that many people have mentioned as a solution to algorithmic bias. So you might say, oh, is this true? So this paper by Bo Kogel and other colleagues, they actually tried to look at this. They tried to see whether having a more diverse set of programmers would result in less biased algorithms. And they say that they find no evidence that female, minority, or low IAT, that is implicit association task, engineers exhibit lower bias or discrimination in their code. We find that bias predictions are mostly caused by biased training data. So they say that like the choices that these people are making actually makes no difference. So how do we reconcile these like two seemingly contradictory perspectives? So again, if you want to think about the experimental design of effects of diversity, we have to seriously think, what pathway do we have in mind, right? There are many different potential pathways of diversity. So the first question, are the programmers here interacting? That is information elaboration pathway relevant at all? They were not interacting together. It was like each person was working separately. So the second question is that if you're focusing on cognitive pathways, how was the task? What was the nature of the task? So if you look at the task, a number of elements of a study designs are fixed, right? So they already gave the problem formulation. I think it was success on some sort of math problem, predicting success in math or something like that. So the problem formulation was fixed. The data collection was fixed. It was given to the participants in this study, which were part of a boot camp, I think. Evaluation metric was fixed. It was a mean square error evaluation metric. Variable names were not given. So like people could not actually see whether there's a variables, each data point belongs to one particular protected attribute or like demographic attribute or not. So all of these things were actually kind of, the task was pretty constrained, right? But we just discussed that in order for cognitive benefits of diversity to be there, the task should allow should have a certain amount of kind of provide room for creativity and innovation. Basically, the task should be complex. This is a kind of a routine task that's you can basically follow in an algorithmic way, right? So there are two things here. One is that the notion of diversity that they use in their paper is kind of a normic one, but maybe problematic. It's normic in the sense that, so if you see, like they say, individuals from minority or females, so on and so forth. It's normic in the sense that it takes an individual as diverse insofar as they diverge from kind of the historically, I suppose, male and white software engineering groups. So that's one thing, but it's kind of, this by itself might be problematic because many people that use the normic notion of diversity, they don't think that someone's identity is necessarily correlated with whether they kind of assume a particular standpoint towards something. So I can get to kind of, that gets a little bit more philosophical. We can get into that. But the most important thing here is that when the task is so constrained, the lack of benefits of diversity is just not very surprising. This is in fact what we should expect. In fact, we should even expect that the teamwork or group work is not going to be useful, whether the group is homogeneous or not. So again, attending to prior work on diversity's impacts is important for kind of, on the one hand, appropriately designing experiments and interpreting the result of experiments. But on the other hand, also like addressing the kind of motivation that Kogil and their colleagues had to even empirically study this question. Because part of it is that many people are making these performative claims about diversity's benefit. And if we want to be serious about this, as opposed to just like making general claims, we need to get serious about this, like so that our claims are not just randomly made, right? So another stage in the design. So in this, now more specifically, but suppose that we have a training data set. Typically, this is a kind of supervised machine learning. Each example comes with a kind of a set of features and also a label that corresponds to it. So the set of features might be, in the case of the students, it might be let's say their grade point average in high school, SAT, other things that they might have prior to application to college, and then the target that's for label, it might be something whether they're a good student or not, depending on, and which might or might not involve human labelers, depending on how we define it. But in certain cases, our target label does include human labelers, right? So when we have these human labels, the important question is that whose knowledge and beliefs are kind of actually encoded in these labels. And these are very important because essentially this is what we are trying to predict. If these labels actually encode somebody's view about, like, suppose that if you decide like a good student is somebody that their supervisor has given a kind of an appraisal about whether they're good or not. So it's important to notice what it is that we're taking as ground truths and what is it that we want to predict. In many cases, there has been shown that there are many cases of bias and the identity of experts in many domains, from medicine to law enforcement, impacts their assessment and in fact might have a longer term outcome. So if I go to a doctor and they kind of repeatedly discount my testimony, I might just not go to doctors anymore. Similarly, in many other domains. Same thing happens, of course, in social algorithms that are used on social media. So again, it's been shown that annotators' identity can influence their judgments in the way that they might label a tweet as hate speech or toxic. Their sentiment analysis of some content, it's like, is it like negative, positive, and in their ability to identify different political stance, or maybe instead of ability, we say like it correlates with how they identify political stance. And this, of course, matters, right? It matters because depending on who is the composition of the human labelers whose views are encoded in data that then will be used to train the predictive algorithms that we use or classification algorithms that we use, the algorithm might behave very differently. So this kind of one aspect of this is news or findings about the racial bias in hate speech detection algorithms, where they systematically misclassify the kind of African American dialect as hate speech, so mistakenly classified as that. And again, recently people in computer science and AI have been interested in thinking about how we can actually consider diversity and disagreements among annotators in a more fruitful way to address this type of issue. And so this paper is by Ida Davani, it's like just came out a couple of months ago. It's a very nice paper. I highly recommend it. And so they're trying to go from this model, which aggregates all of the data and like trains one model, to this type of model that tries to keep the opinions of different annotators or different human labelers throughout the design, and only at the task time when we are trying to predict, kind of aggregate their opinion. But still, in most of these cases, again, the idea is that like we use diversity. Again, we need to understand like why might diversity be useful, and what sense of diversity might be useful, right? So suppose that in some cases, the issue is that, and so this comes really in a Spanish language corpus, there might be more representation of individuals or labelers, annotators from certain Spanish-speaking countries. But of course, the slangs and dialects are different between countries. And so in that case, we might want to have a representative notion of diversity, so that there are individuals from those countries who are represented in the way that the data, the truth value of the data is given. In certain other cases, let's say in cases where, in terms of the findings, where individuals with kind of certain, I think there's findings like if you say like I'm gay, like somebody wants to kind of announce their identity, that's mistakenly identified as toxic tweet. So again, in those cases, individuals from a minority group might have a better perspective for figuring out what counts as hate speech, what counts as toxic speech, and what's not. Because many things that like individuals from dominant perspectives might find okay might actually be derogatory, and they're just kind of, they don't notice it. So in certain other cases, what we really want might be something more along the line of normic notion of diversity. And obviously this has implications, and some of the works that we are currently doing is like developing methods for integrating information in a way that actually takes these things into account. Because if you just average things, that does not do this. And finally, kind of I want to finish with this, and this is a case that, so suppose that we have designed the system, we had the data, we know what type of labelers, whose views actually impacted the data. Now, what is it that, with what purpose do we want to design this model? Especially when the model is used to kind of guide human or assist human decision maker. How do we decide like how this design of the team, human AI team would go? Now, if you look at the news, in many cases, the narrative around the design of AI systems or the kind of evolution of AI systems and machine learning system is always like, this AI system beat human beings. So like in this task, human experts, human doctors were beaten, human judges were beaten, and so on and so forth. Like it's this kind of individualistic competitive narrative, which kind of assumes that the best predictive model is also the best for supporting human decision-making. But if you remember, the meaningful endpoint in these cases is not the kind of having the best individual, it's having the best team. And if you remember, the best individual, in this case, the best predictive model, might not even be part of the best team. So it matters how we design these systems and what else do we do with them. And so there are right now interesting work in this domain in terms of, on the one hand, kind of changing our optimization objectives so that when possible, the algorithms learn to complement human beings. So for instance, one thing that you might do, try to optimize the model, not that it makes the fewest number of mistakes, but that it commits mistakes on cases, if it commits fewest number of mistakes on cases that are hard for human beings. And we say that if you kind of make a mistake in other cases, it's not that important. So we give a special weight on those cases that are, it's hard for humans, so the idea is that they don't overlap in their kind of abilities. And research has shown that you can make substantial gains in the performance of the human plus AI when you design systems like that. And of course, it depends on the context when those things can actually be done. Other works looks at possibilities for deferring to experts. So you have a system, you've already designed it, but you might have different ways of assessing the confidence of the system. So the system can not report not only a kind of predicted label or class for some example, but also give confidence scores about how confident this prediction is, or the level of uncertainty associated with the prediction. And if it's high, you might make the kind of additional system, kind of a deferral system that kind of defers to a human being. Now notice that in both of these cases, we might interestingly use, both of them firstly involve issues of diversity as in a team, but we can also kind of think about sociocultural diversity in some of these cases. With respect to who is it that we want to defer on what type of cases. If it is a kind of a type of case that individuals from certain groups might have more experience with, it might be a good idea, though there are complications, to defer to their opinion. And the pathways that we talked about in terms of pathways of influence of diversity, both of them become relevant here in different senses. So I talked about kind of who influences the design and goals of the system. As I said, there are many different things, and we discussed many of these in the paper. But the key points to take away is that throughout the design and kind of the life cycle of the machine learning systems, issues of sociocultural diversity always arise whenever you're making a decision, because these are socially embedded systems. So it's not very surprising. It would be surprising if we ignore them. And if we don't want to ignore them, then we have to seriously think about issues about concepts and pathways of diversity. And so we really need to bridge that gap between these different disciplines. So for instance, when we're thinking about the metrics, we need to think about concepts, because concepts provide us with the bridge that we need between our kind of intention and motivation and the way that we implement that. Similarly, when we are considering whether kind of diversity can be beneficial or can have useful epistemic properties for the design of the algorithms, then we have to actually be serious about what type of pathway is relevant there. What are the effect modifiers? If we are focusing on a particular pathway, have we designed the task in a way that actually can provide those type of benefits that we might want to expect? And of course, diversity is not kind of unmitigated good. There are many different challenges that remain, both conceptual challenges, philosophical challenges, as well as challenges in the implementation of many ideas in context. So there's lots of exciting work to be done. But for now, thanks for listening to the talk, and I'm looking forward to kind of discussing some of this work more with you.